After taking office, President Donald Trump quickly announced plans to impose a 25% tariff on all imports from Canada. For years, parts of the U.S. have relied on Canadian electricity to stabilize their power grids, but this energy relationship has mostly gone unnoticed. However, as tensions between the U.S. and Canada rise, Canada is now reconsidering its role as a major energy supplier. If talks break down, Canada might even limit its electricity exports, which could cause big disruptions in the U.S. The conflict started in late 2024 when President Trump, in a private meeting with Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, casually suggested that Canada should become part of the U.S. Trudeau responded with a polite smile, but Trump continued, claiming that Canadians would have lower taxes and better health care if they joined the U.S. It wasn't clear if Trump was serious, but a few days later, he posted on social media referring to Trudeau as Governor Justin Trudeau of the great state of Canada, sparking online debate. This led to further speculation, with some seeing it as a serious policy shift, while others dismissed it as political exaggeration. Canadian officials largely stayed quiet at first to avoid making the situation worse. However, a few days later, Trump claimed that many Canadians wanted closer ties with the U.S., even though he provided no evidence for this. In Canada, most people dismissed this as unrealistic. The situation worsened in January 2025 when Trump announced the 25% tariff on Canadian imports. He said it was in response to Canada's poor border security and claimed the U.S. had been subsidizing Canada through trade imbalances. The tariffs, which would affect key Canadian exports like lumber, steel, and agricultural products, would have a significant economic impact. On January 7th, Trudeau rejected the idea of Canada joining the U.S., saying there isn't a snowball's chance in hell that Canada will ever become part of the United States. Trump didn't back down but continued to argue that Canada would benefit economically and militarily if it joined the U.S. He promised lower taxes, more business opportunities, and improved national security. On February 1st, Trump formally signed the executive order to impose the 25% tariff, which would take effect on February 4th. In response, Canada quickly announced its own countermeasures. On February 2nd, it imposed tariffs on $155 billion worth of U.S. imports. These tariffs were designed to target key U.S. industries, signaling that Canada wouldn't just accept America's pressure. Canadian officials also considered limiting American access to Canada's energy resources, which could have severe consequences for the U.S. Ontario. Premier Doug Ford even suggested cutting electricity exports to U.S. states like Minnesota, Michigan, and New York, where millions of Americans rely on Canadian power. In addition to these actions, Canada began looking for new trade relationships, particularly with Asian countries like China, Japan, and South Korea. The completion of the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion in May 2024 allowed Canada to send more oil to the Pacific coast. Reducing its reliance on the U.S. Alberta's government also took steps to strengthen energy ties with Asian markets, particularly focusing on liquefied natural gas, LNG exports to Japan. As tensions rose, Canadians were encouraged to support local businesses and reduce reliance on American goods. The Canadian government also began working on making internal trade between provinces more efficient, building a stronger internal market to lessen the country's dependence on the U.S. Behind all these economic measures, the Canadian government started to realize that the issue was bigger than trade. It was also about protecting Canadian resources. Trump's repeated comments about Canada becoming part of the U.S. raised concerns that there was a larger strategic plan to control Canada's energy, minerals, and fresh water. By late February 2025, it was clear that the conflict had moved beyond a simple trade dispute. Canada was rethinking its long-term economic strategy, focusing on greater independence and exploring alternative markets. The U.S.-Canada relationship, built on mutual reliance for decades, was facing a dramatic shift that could change the course of their economic future. In early 2025, Canada's leaders had to face an uncomfortable truth. Was it wise to remain so dependent on the United States, a country that had shown it was willing to use economic pressure for political gain? This concern wasn't just a hypothetical scenario. President Trump had repeatedly suggested that Canada would be better off as part of the U.S., a statement that started as provocative but was now being taken more seriously by the Canadian government. Trump's remarks, once dismissed as political talk, now seemed to signal a larger interest in Canada's resources, something the U.S. felt it had a right to access. Canada wasn't just an important trade partner for the U.S., it was also a critical supplier of resources. For example, Canada was the fourth largest oil producer in the world, and most of its oil, about 97%, was exported to the U.S. Canada also supplied the U.S. with natural gas, which was especially important during the winter months when American homes and businesses relied on it for heating. Additionally, Canada was a key supplier of minerals like nickel and aluminum, which were essential for industries in the U.S., including electric vehicle production. As tensions rose, Canadian officials began considering whether they should limit the flow of these vital resources to the U.S. For years, Canada's energy and mineral exports had been seen as a stable part of the trade relationship, but now the question was, if the U.S. was willing to impose tariffs without negotiations, why should Canada continue to allow unrestricted access to resources it relied on for economic stability? The idea of restricting or rerouting these exports created immediate concern in Washington. The U.S. economy was heavily dependent on Canadian resources, and any disruption would be costly and destabilizing. Canada, aware of the stakes, started exploring new trade partnerships, especially in Asia. The Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, which was completed in 2024, put Canada in a strong position to shift oil exports to China, Japan, and South Korea. Alongside this, Canada worked to strengthen its natural gas agreements with various Asian nations and explored new opportunities in its mining sector, particularly in nickel and rare earth minerals. Internally, Canada began focusing on reducing reliance on U.S. imports. A national campaign to buy local gained traction, with Canadians shifting their spending toward domestic products rather than American ones. At the government level, there was a push to simplify internal trade within Canada, something that had been complicated by overlapping provincial regulations. This shift aimed to make the country's domestic market stronger and more self-sufficient, less vulnerable to external economic pressures. Amid these discussions, Canadian policymakers began to worry about whether Trump's ultimate goal was more than just economic leverage. Was the U.S. looking to gain direct control over Canada's vast natural resources, including energy, water, and minerals? This concern became more pressing as Canada prepared for a possible change in its global positioning. Rather than simply reacting to tariffs, Canada was taking steps to diversify its economy, reduce reliance on the U.S., and ensure its long-term economic independence. Strengthening trade with Europe and Asia, investing in domestic production, and fostering economic resilience were now seen as necessary steps to secure Canada's future. The events of early 2025 made it clear that Canada's relationship with the United States could no longer be assumed to be stable or mutually beneficial. As a result, Canada was preparing for a future in which its economic priorities were no longer determined by proximity to the U.S., but by the need to protect its own financial and strategic independence.